Hello everyone. I'm not really doing fancy visuals today, I'm just gonna rant. I finished Volume 2 on Christmas, and I'll be honest, I was really disappointed, for reasons that are probably obvious if you've been following my channel. A lot of people are reacting to Will's coming out scene, especially the line where he says that Mike was his Tammy. I wanted to talk about that because that line discouraged me as well. On the surface, to me, it feels like Will might be invalidating his feelings for Mike and throwing cold water on the idea that Mike could also be gay. Even though I don't personally think that's necessarily what's happening from a storytelling perspective, that initial impression still matters. It doesn't change how disappointing that moment felt to me as a viewer. Part of my disappointment comes from the fact that the appearance of Will's feelings being invalidated is enough to make me pause and want to emotionally protect myself, if you know what I mean. Even if that isn't the intended meaning, the fact that that scene can be read that way is still difficult for me to process. This may or may not be my last video about Byler, and if things don't turn out the way I hope, this will probably be the first and last ship I ever get this emotionally invested in. Either way, I hope you'll stick around. I don't only talk about Byler. Anyway, back to what I was saying. A lot of people are treating Will's coming out scene as definitive proof that Mike and Will are not endgame. I don't personally read it that way, and I want to explain why. In my view, in order for Mike and Will not to be endgame in a way that actually makes sense, one of two things would need to happen. First, Will's feelings for Mike would have to be completely invalidated. I find that highly unlikely, given the amount of backlash surrounding the invalidation of queer feelings in the past. It's also hard for me to believe that this would be the intended direction, considering that the Duffer Brothers as well as Noah have repeatedly stated in interviews that Will's feelings were definitely real. For that not to be true, they would essentially have to be lying, which just feels bizarre and unlikely to me. The second possibility would be that Mike's queer coding would have to be invalidated, or else it would effectively become queerbaiting. That also feels like an extremely difficult position for the writers to work around. Because of that, I don't personally see either option as very viable, and that's why I don't think the scene is as definitive as people are claiming. When Will talks about his feelings, he never says they weren't real. He doesn't reframe them as confusion, obsession, or something he imagined. What he says is that he believed Mike was not like him, meaning straight, and based on that belief, he accepted that he shouldn't pursue the relationship. The Tammy comparison is where things get complicated. When Robin talked about Tammy, she was very specific. She said her feelings were about confusion and fear. She said she was looking for answers, and she directly concluded that it was never really about Tammy herself. In other words, Robin intentionally invalidated her own feelings as part of her process of understanding herself. Will does not do that. Will never reframes his feelings for Mike as confusion or fear. He never says he imagined them. He never says they weren't real. So when Will says that Mike was his Tammy and then clarifies that it wasn't about Mike, I don't interpret that as him doing what Robin did. To me, it sounds like Will is saying that accepting himself doesn't depend on whether Mike returns those feelings, not that the feelings themselves were fake. That distinction matters to me. It also connects to something I said in a previous video. In my view, if we're using Tammy as a symbolic idea, meaning someone a person relies on for validation or self-definition, then Elle fits more cleanly as Mike's Tammy than Mike fits as Will's. But drawing that parallel doesn't mean Tammy plays the same role for everyone. I don't see Tammy as a one-to-one metaphor. I see it as more of a symbol of relying on someone else to feel whole. To me, that person could be virtually anyone. For example, a role model, a friend, a crush, or someone you genuinely love. So when Will calls Mike his Tammy, I don't automatically take that to mean his feelings weren't real. I read it as him realizing that he can't rely on Mike or anyone to validate who he is. That's simply how I interpret it. From my perspective, Will's feelings for Mike developed slowly and consistently and were grounded in a real emotional bond. That doesn't read as obsession to me, it reads as a slow burn relationship that he believes won't be returned, not one he believes was imaginary. I also think the timing of the confession matters. Earlier in season 4, in the van scene, Will talks about the idea of ripping off a band-aid rather than living in uncertainty. He frames it through Elle, but I always read that moment as Will talking about his own feelings indirectly, using Elle as a cover. He says that if Elle were going to lose Mike, she'd rather get it over quickly, like ripping off a band-aid. Because of that, I think Will choosing to come out to everyone at once actually makes sense for his character. If people were going to reject him or pull away, I think he'd rather have that happen all at once instead of dragging it out. At first, him coming out in that group setting felt a little off to me, but then I thought back to that scene, what Will said himself. It started to feel more in character. More importantly, everyone accepts him after that. My issue isn't that Mike and Will have to be endgame. My issue is that, in my view, the story has already committed to certain things that make separating them difficult to resolve cleanly. It seems to me that the story treats Will's feelings as genuine, and it also seems to me that Mike has been written with consistent queer coding across multiple seasons. From my perspective, the Tammy line alone does not undo either of those things. So if Mike and Will aren't endgame, I think the story will still need to address those threads in some meaningful way. That's why I don't personally see this scene as shutting the door as definitively as some people do. My position isn't certainty, it's caution. Because once a story commits this deeply, walking it back without disappointing people is harder than it might look. I don't really know how this story is going to end. I might sound confident, but that confidence comes from how much time I've spent thinking about this and forming my opinions, not from certainty about the outcome. I really hope things don't go in a direction that feels dismissive because I've invested, admittedly, probably too much time in this ship over the years. There are other things I like about Stranger Things, but I got invested in this ship because I was impressed by the amount of evidence. It never felt like pure fantasy to me, and that's what drew me in. And honestly, I've been on Will's side since day one. So I really hope the Duffer Brothers pull through and that the ending isn't so heartbreaking that it makes me not want to invest in future Stranger Things stories. I heard the final episode is going to be emotional. I just hope it doesn't cross that line for me. Anyway, I hope you all had a good Christmas, and I'll see you in my next video, even if it's not about Byler. Bye!